Thank you very much, Stefan. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for taking the time to join this seminar. I'm very happy to be here. What a fantastic institute you have here. I'm thinking that maybe if there's even a job going for washing dishes, then maybe I can volunteer. So yeah, here we are to talk about quite a sort of serious topic, and maybe some of you have sort of been paying attention, I think, to sort of this energy transition topic. And I'm going to be focusing on the so-called oil majors, which are companies that supply a lot of the gas and the oil to the global energy system. And I'll be focusing on 4 of these companies today, and I'll be looking at their net zero strategies and also their behavior regarding the use of carbon offsets. So I'm going to jump straight into this if this is okay, and I plan to sort of leave as much time at the end as possible. Okay, sure. So as we know, we've got this, long-term global plan of attaining carbon neutrality by at least at the latest 2050, and this would require a major transformation of the business models of carbon-intensive fossil fuel producers. And there's been a lot of sort of attention to the particular 4 companies that I'm looking at, and that's because it's been shown that they've actually their energy products have collectively make up over 10% of global historical emissions. And this number has been calculated by Heed there in the citation, and he's updated that number as well recently as well. And the oil majors, they've always sort of attracted a lot of attention from stakeholders and from researchers, usually for the wrong reasons. And that's because there's quite a sort of long history that's been documented by researchers from many academic disciplines that showed that they've actually taken many calculated measures to delay action, for climate change. And that's taken the form of lobbying to stop climate policy, not really spending much on renewable energy, and also spreading disinformation. There's been some very interesting papers on this topic. The most recent one came out in Science that was in relation to ExxonMobil. However, these same oil companies recently proclaimed to be sort of part of the solution now. And they've moved from this sort of, position of, denying that the problem exists to now proclaiming that they're part of the solution. And so we have them sort of using the words of energy transition. This has really emerged into their sort of marketing discourse. And we have, a company like ExxonMobil now that is promising to be, to play a leading role in the energy transition. So the idea of, net zero energy transition, this is very frequently occurring in their public communication materials over the past year or a couple of years. And this is part of a wider trend. And so we have, large companies all across the world sort of under pressure to adopt a net zero target. And we have also this temptation to sort of rely upon offsetting to achieve that. And that's because net zero sort of talks about, you are basically going to reduce as many emissions as you can in-house. And for those so-called hard to abate or residual emissions, you are authorized to sort of conduct projects outside the value chain to absorb or to offset those emissions. So these sort of 2 concepts have a symbiotic relationship. And we have a study here called Net Zero Stocktake that's looking at the top 2,000 Forbes companies. And we've got the N here of 700 companies. And we have about 40% that have said, yes, we're going to use offsets. And then we have a larger portion in black, which is unknown, but that still has a possibility to use offsets. So we see that clearly many companies that have a net zero target intends to use offsets. So just for those in the room who are maybe not so familiar with offsets, let's quickly do a bit of revision here. We have basically 2 very broad categories of offsets. We have the so-called emissions removal. And this emissions, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get my mouse working here. Emissions removal would be something in the form of planting trees, so afforestation. This would be as the tree grows, it absorbs carbon from the atmosphere. We have another type, which is emissions avoidance. This is especially from renewable energy projects. The premise here is that by building a wind farm, building a solar farm, you're actually reducing the need to burn fossil fuels to generate electricity. So this is another category of offsets. And the idea is that a polluter would sort of, invest in these particular projects. And these are typically in developing countries, and they would then be purchased in the form of a carbon offset. And the idea is that these are these are purchased in the form of tons of carbon. So just please try and retain this mental distinction between emissions removal, which is mainly afforestation. This could be, for example, direct air capture, by the way, of course. And then we have this emissions avoidance. And so there's been several studies over the years that have sort of tried to look at, the climate benefits that are claimed by these carbon credit developers and users. And we've got a study here from a few years ago that's sort of looking at the CDM, that's the United Nations Clean Development Mechanism, that's very widely used. And that was looking at India, and that was looking at wind generation projects. And that concluded that about 50% of those projects would have been built anyway, which means that the claimed additionality of these projects is not substantiated. And so this concept of additionality is important, because the idea is, if you're sort of creating carbon credits from a renewable energy project, you were saying, without this financing from the carbon market, we wouldn't be able to build these windmills. Therefore, by giving us money, we're going to build wind turbines, and they don't actually remove carbon from the atmosphere, but they're actually going to reduce the need to operate fossil fuels to create electricity. So bringing online a project that would not exist without offsets is a really fundamental principle that upholds the legitimacy of the carbon market. And in this case, CDM's case, it's been shown to be quite shaky. Then we had a recent paper in the prestigious PNAS, the Preceding National Academy of the Sciences in the US, that looked at only 12 RED projects from Brazil, but that found across all these projects the common feature of exaggerated baselines. The baseline is referring to the historical deforestation trends. These forest conservation projects claim to stop deforestation. And by choosing a baseline that shows a very, very sort of generous amount of historical deforestation, you generate the ability to produce a large amount of credits. That's been questioned by this paper. And then just this year, we had a paper that was covered by Bloomberg that showed a researcher from California, University of California, that looked at the world's 300 largest forest management projects, which includes RED projects. And that also raised the same concern that the climate benefits are exaggerated because of exaggerated baselines. So we've got a lot of criticism about the climate benefits of carbon offsets from academic researchers. Then, given this sort of concern about maybe the uncertainty of the climate benefits of carbon credits, we've got this concern within the United Nations now that companies should not be relying on offsets to meet their net zero pledges. So we've got a very powerful statement here from the UN Secretary General that was raised in a high-level expert group just last year. And this was a report about net zero pledges that they issued sort of, to the global market. And this speech was given as they presented this report. And so I'm just going to read this out to you. The Secretary General says, "I have a message to fossil fuel companies and their financial enablers. So-called net zero pledges that exclude core products and activities, so for example, fossil fuel production, are poisoning our planet. Using bogus net zero pledges to cover up massive fossil fuel expansion is reprehensible. It's rank deception." Very strong language here. "This toxic cover-up could push our world over the climate cliff. Targets must be reached through real emission cuts. In other words, not through offsets. Fossil fuels must be phased out and renewable energy scaled up." So they're really saying that if you are serious about net zero, then please don't use offsets. This really has been a message that's come out of the United Nations Working Group over the past 6 months. So in my study, I'm focusing on, net zero and offsets. There are two concepts that drive this study, looking at the aforementioned 4 oil majors. And basically, the grander objective is to sort of determine if these oil majors are on the process of a transition or not. And I broke up this analysis into 2 parts. The first part is looking at their net zero strategies and just looking for differences and similarities. And I'll explain this in a moment. And then I'm also looking especially for the presence of plans to scale down the supply of fossil fuels. The supply of fossil fuels includes sale of fossil fuels and production of fossil fuels. Then looking at offsets and basically what type of offsets are they using and how do they use that in their business strategy. So without further ado, let's jump into just a few little sort of features of the frameworks. Please forgive my driving skills. I think the slides are jumping around here. So yeah, previous research does exist on oil majors. It's quite impressive to see more and more studies are coming online. And a lot of researchers, myself included, have tried to sort of, make sense of these, different sort of environmental performance and behavior of the oil majors. And we use different metrics. And some people sort of, look at, do they have net zero targets? They look at the scope of these, scope 1 or 2. Then some people focus on actual environmental performance, yearly emissions. or the type of emissions reduction targets in place. Some people look at, investments in renewables, or the managerial emphasis on renewables, and other researchers look at fossil fuel production trends. And so, of course, all these indicators are, they tell us part of the story, whether a company is transitioning or not. But we argue that a very, very important and often overlooked factor in the energy transition is the need to downscale and then eventually eliminate the supply of fossil fuels. So we sort of include this in our analysis. We include it qualitatively, I have to say, not quantitatively. That's sort of been done in a previous paper, the quantitative part. So conceptually, my thinking looks like this. If we have this current type of model, we know that today that at best renewables are a side business despite all the rhetoric. And the idea is, if we're looking at sort of, a business model transformation that's going to take us to net zero, it's going to look like this part in red here. It's going to look like we're going to see a planned downscaling of oil and gas, and we're going to see a rapid and massive increase of renewable energy to fill that gap. So the idea is that the renewable energy is not additional, it's replacing fossil fuels. And this is a transformation-driven sort of, transition. Then we have this other option, which is basically about conserving the existing business model. And this basically just, slowly expands the share of renewable energy, but maintains that fossil fuel businesses. And we try and reduce emissions by technological improvement, carbon capture, and then carbon offsets. This is one of the options we have. So these are two sort of, conceptual pathways I'm thinking about as we carry out this study. And so we come up with like a very simple sort of, triple litmus test here to determine if we think the companies are pursuing this first transformation pathway or not. And that's basically asking, first of all, about the scope of the emissions. So I'm just trying to get the mouse back on screen. Here we are. So yeah, does the net zero strategy include the ambition to reduce all scope 3 emissions? Scope 3 emissions follows on from scope 1 and 2. And scope 3 basically includes the emissions that come from the burning of the fossil fuels. In other words, the emissions that come from users. So for example, if people outside are driving gasoline vehicles, putting CO2 in the atmosphere, the oil companies would take responsibility for that. They're increasingly expected to. If we don't include scope 3 emissions and we still claim to be pursuing net zero, we're basically cutting out about 85% of life cycle emissions. So it's expected by not only academics, but also stakeholders that oil companies account for these emissions. The next thing is we would expect to see a plan to reduce the supply of all fossil fuels. That includes, as I said before, not just production, but also sales. I'm going to explain in the findings a little bit more about this distinction. And then the idea is that if a company was serious about transitioning through the transformation pathway, then they would not rely on offsets, which is why we have this very just simple yes or no question of, does the company intend to rely on offsets or not? And then in the second part of the paper, we focus in detail on the offset behavior. So there's a very interesting conversation going on right now about quality offsets. And we have on one hand, the advocates of offsets that claim to be using high quality offsets. And not surprisingly, these are especially coming from the oil majors, basically commercial entities that have a large stake in the market. And on the other hand, we have people sitting in neutral positions, or like maybe sort of more so kind of academic positions that are saying, no, these are not quality, they're rubbish. And the Bloomberg article is quite interesting. I decided not to include the results here, but basically they focus on renewable energy, and they argue very strongly that renewable energy based offset credits are not additional because it really just doesn't really make sort of economic sense to build a fossil fuel power plant anymore. And so they're sort of saying that most of the carbon neutrality claims by large companies are based upon renewable energy, which they consider as junk. So this is one of the particular type of discussions that's taking place. So what is a quality offset? Obviously, we can't really define that, I think, with any degree of confidence, but there's still a lot of hints that are coming from I wouldn't say academic researchers, it's coming more from the industry itself. We have sort of some frameworks within the industry that are very, very concerned about the reputation of carbon offsets, that are trying to set guidelines. And then we have sort of, academics as well, throwing in their 2 cents worth. And then, so we have this idea that a quality offset is going to be one that removes emissions permanently. There's 2 key words here, removes. So we're not looking at emissions avoidance, like a renewable energy project that avoids emissions. This wouldn't really classify as a quality offset for many stakeholders. Permanently means that even if we plant trees and absorb carbon, we need to be doing this permanently. And permanently meaning probably beyond a human lifetime, probably on the order of several centuries. And how possible is it to do that? That's a very difficult question to answer. But anyway, this is the expectation from many areas. The idea is that the offset project should be ideally implemented, quite recently. We don't want to be looking at, these historical kind of what are they called? Zombie projects that are floating around, these ghost projects that still have credits that haven't been sold. Then we use these in the current day to see that, hey, the carbon we dug up and burned today has been offset. So that's another type of argument, like the age of the offsets. So in my project, I'm looking especially at this distinction between avoidance and removal and the age of projects and offsets. And there's a few very strong hints here. We have the Science-Based Targets Initiative that says that a company is not allowed to use avoidance credits if they want to claim to be moving towards net zero. Then the United Nations offsetting scheme for aviation also has said, I'm not really sure why they chose 2016, but they chose this year and said this is the line in the sand. You cannot use credits or projects that are from before this year. So please try and remember these two little indicators here. So in the study, I combined qualitative data with quantitative data. The qualitative data is just using documents from the companies themselves and from third parties. And then the quantitative data is coming from the carbon market. So I look at what's called the carbon registries. And the carbon registries is basically a publicly accessible database that shows records of whenever a carbon offset was retired and withdrawn off the market. And in an ideal case, the name of the entity that retired that credit would be there, along with the year of the credit was issued and the amount. And in many cases, it doesn't exist. For example, with the clean development mechanism, in many cases, the companies will conceal their names, or they don't, or because it was purchased through a third party, the name isn't there. So this data is not perfect, but it's the best way we have for tracking the offsetting activity of these carbon majors. Then I supplement this in this particular study with CDP. What's that? Carbon Disclosure Project, because of the 4 majors, 2 disclose their decarbonization activity to this CDP. And so I look at these reports and get also evidence for offsetting activity from there. And then so I create a database based upon this carbon offsetting activity. And I organize this database by the company, by the offset project, and by the records of retirements. And this data drives the analysis of offsetting. And it's the first of its kind database. And just instead of showing you a raw Excel sheet, here's a screenshot. It looks like this. We have basically one sheet that looks at the projects. And these projects are coming from basically a project for which credits has been retired that I find on the carbon registry, or it's coming from basically their public communications where they claim to be using this project. And whether or not they retire credits from this is another question that I cannot answer, because of the sometimes opaqueness in the carbon market. Looks like the lights have gone out in this room. I think it's kind of okay in the screen though there. I think we're kind of looking quite nice there. And then, so that's the project level. And I just basically just simple coding here, the type of project. Then I look at the credit level, and I basically collect evidence of every time there's a retirement against a certain project. So I have the carbon credit information and the carbon offset project information. And there's lots and lots of gaps. This is by all means not as comprehensive as I would like it to be. So let's go into and so this is part of an academic study that was just published online last week. And I was hoping to be able to show you, well, hey, this paper's being covered by the media. Here's like a nice media article, but we kind of, it hasn't really worked out the timing of everything. We just released our press release yesterday. So if we're lucky, we might get some attention. This is actually a follow-up study for a study that appeared on the front page of the Guardian newspaper last year. So we're trying to, hopefully get some, maybe public attention because we think it's an important topic. So if we're lucky, we might get some coverage in the next few days. So results. And sorry, if you're interested, I think someone would kindly send this email through the Zoom of the through the chat on Zoom, and you can download. So you can't download the paper because we didn't pay the money for. I've taken a bit of a stand recently against these open access fees, and so here's one: a free reading access. So you can read the paper, but you can't download it. But I think you probably all can access it from Monash shortly. Results. So let's go very quickly. The indicator analysis. I just want to check the time. Okay, yeah, indicator analysis. So here we have basically the answers. I mean, this is just binary, yes or no. It's not maybe not so sophisticated or interesting, but the idea is that I think this shows a very, very powerful overview of whether these companies are really sort of serious about transitioning. We have here basically a big, big distinction between the American majors and the European majors. We know this distinction exists. We know that from previous studies that they seem to be much more serious about decarbonization, which means that they're actually including scope 3 emissions in their net zero strategies. The American majors don't include these, even though all four of these claim to be pursuing net zero. There's basically a huge difference in the amount of emissions that we're talking about by excluding scope 3 here. Basically, use of offsets long-term, all of these companies seem to be, 3 of them very explicitly saying we're going to use offsets. I think Chevron, from memory, is saying depending net zero depends on the availability of offsets even. So there's some very strong statements from certain companies. BP is much more nuanced, but I think we can assume that they are looking at offsets to achieve net zero target. However, in 2030, they claim to be not using offsets for their own net zero gains. Now, no company has in place a plan to basically reduce their sales of offsets, their sales of fossil fuels. Now, let me explain this probably on the next slide or two, because we're looking at not only the self-production of fossil fuels, of oil and gas, but we also, these oil majors will also purchase third-party produced oil and gas and sell that. And this forms part of their supply of fossil fuels to the global market. So if we're serious about an energy transition, we'd expect to see a target to scale this down. That's missing in all the oil majors. Now, BP was for a couple of years attracting sort of almost maybe praise for its actually explicit plans to progressively scale down its oil and gas production. And Shell actually was pledging to scale down on the percent of 1 or 2% per year until 2030. Now, I published this paper and I was very surprised and almost disappointed to see that my study didn't pick up that they've actually backtracked on this target. There was talk of them backtracking on this target, which I got in the paper, but only last week I was very surprised to see that actually they've joined, maybe we can skip a slide here and I'll come back to this slide. But yeah, we are very surprised to see that Shell, well, I wasn't surprised, I was expecting this to come, but yeah, it's been announced by the media now that Shell have actually backtracked on their target and they've abandoned the target of reducing their fossil fuels. So why is this happening? That's because, as we know, fossil fuel profits are huge right now. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the price of oil has shot up. We know windfall profits are occurring in oil and gas companies. So basically, Shell has abandoned any plans to downscale their fossil fuel production and reaffirm their plans to grow their gas production. Long term, it seems to be that Shell is trying to downscale oil in favor of gas, because the expectation is that long term, globally, oil will be replaced with gas, obviously in different industrial sectors, however. BP also has weakened its targets, and since February, they're originally planning to reduce fossil fuel production by 40%. That's now been downscaled to 25%. So that's some important news, and unfortunately I couldn't capture this. So this table actually is kind of giving too many points to Shell. Actually, it was just we missed this by a week. This is, I think, one of the difficulties about this type of research. We're looking at corporate behavior. The corporate world moves very fast. People like myself are snails. The peer review is even slower. This was really hard to capture, so please, please understand that. But yeah, the decarbonization pathway, basically no one's on a transformation pathway. That's the conclusion here. So what's happening? Chevron and Exxon have both explicitly told shareholders that they're actually out there to increase their fossil fuel production. What I don't show on the table is that they're actually using intensity-based targets. Chevron very explicitly says that it chose this carbon intensity target to reach net zero because it gives them the flexibility to grow. In other words, it gives them the flexibility to increase their overall fossil fuel production. They can still achieve net zero for scope 1 and 2 emissions if they use that intensity basis. And then ExxonMobil is even explicitly telling its shareholders that they were telling them last year that they're going to grow their production by 10%. Over the next few years. And this message has continued into this year as well. And I've just covered this situation with Shell. I've just explained to you that they had a previous target of reducing their oil production, which a lot of people, thought it's a baby step, but it's really important. That's been erased. And then Shell doesn't include any ambitions to downgrade its, to reduce its oil sales. Notice BP. Let's have a quick look at this. And actually, the transport sales of BP, actually, there's up until about 2 years ago, they were quite explicitly talking about plans to increase transport fuel sales, so gasoline in emerging markets. This is, like developing countries. So why is it important that we look at third-party sales here? We have a graph. If I'm not mistaken, this is an Australian researcher. I forget the name here. There's quite an impressive Australian think tank that produced this report here. You might take a look at it if you're interested. And they're looking here at BP, and they're showing us in grey here that the volume of fossil fuels that are bought from third parties for BP exceeds the volume of self-produced fossil fuels. That's why it's very important that we have a target that also concerns the sale of fossil fuels. It's not enough just to say we're just going to, we're going to decrease our own production, and we're going to divest these offsets. So these production facilities, sell them to other companies. They're just going to keep producing fossil fuels, and we're just going to buy them and throw our logo on it. That's not what we want to see happening for an energy transition. So that's quite superficial. This net zero strategy analysis. Let's go into the offsetting now.
About 10 minutes.
Yep, sure. Okay. So basically, what sectors are these companies using their offsetting? And ExxonMobil basically have been excluded from the coming analysis. That's because they don't really talk about using offsets or tying it in with their business operations. 3 companies are serious about them. The main sort of area where we're seeing a lot of offsetting activity is the delivery of liquefied natural gas. I'm going to explain this on the next slide, but there's this claim that the full life cycle of this liquefied natural gas is being neutralized. It's carbon neutral. How is that possible? It's simply by buying offsets and providing these offsets to deliver together with the LNG to the customer and saying, here you go, this is carbon neutral gas. And Shell was the first company to do this. Then BP joined the market, and then Chevron has joined the market recently. In Europe, I'm not sure if you have this in Australia, the driver at the pump has the option of offsetting their gasoline purchase. And this is attracting, I think, a lot of sort of maybe negative publicity recently in Europe. But all 3 companies are doing this. Chevron has recently started doing this in Singapore. And then the airline industry, the oil majors, I don't cover this in today's presentation, but they've been doing experiments with providing offset aviation fuel to airlines, as well as providing big packages of offsets, so airlines can provide these offsets to their customers who want to offset their flight. So it's supplying offsets as well as supplying offset bundled aviation fuel. This is I'm not going to focus that in the coming slides. Let's have a quick look now about these carbon neutral LNG shipments. So about 5 years ago, I remember seeing, I got a news flash, in an emailing list that said that the world's first delivery of carbon neutral LNG took place. And I was like, wow, what is this? This is amazing. This is a game changer. And I was quite surprised to see this is just conventional LNG. It's been offset. And so this happened in 2019, and this was the world's first that this happened. Since then, there's been about 40 deliveries of these LNG cargoes delivered that have been offset, and that's only the ones that have been tracked. That's been a year since this data was collected, and when we deliver one of these cargoes of LNG, to neutralize this, we have to retire the equivalent of probably around 250,000 tons of CO2. This is a massive, retirement to take place on the voluntary carbon offset market. Now, if we look at sort of this very rough back of the envelope calculation of say $6 a ton, that's assuming like a avoidance credit, the cheapest type of credits. We'd be looking at adding $1.5 million US to the cargo. This is quite an important cost. And since the global supply crunch for LNG, it seems to be that this interest in carbon neutral LNG is kind of become a little bit weaker. However, Chevron came into the game in September just last year with their first delivery, and they promised in this press release that this will be the first of many to come. So the oil majors are quite serious about using offsets to claim that their hydrocarbon products are carbon neutral. Now, in my database, I looked at the type of projects that they're retiring, well, they claim to be retiring credits from. So this data here is basically showing you any project that was mentioned in public communication materials by the majors. Whether or not they have retired credits from these projects is something that I can't confirm in this particular graph. But anyway, so just going by the projects they claim to be using, we see that the portion of removal projects for two of these majors, for Chevron and for BP, is extremely low. And we see like quite a strong reliance on nature-based avoidance, which basically is red projects, it's forest conservation or renewable energy projects. Shell actually has quite you know, a considerable number of removal projects, but these are just basically projects in the pipeline or projects that it claims to be using, for which I didn't find evidence of. I'll show you this in the next slide. Or sorry, I'll correct that statement, for which I found limited evidence of usage for. Now, the reason I don't regard the project itself as a very good sort of type of data, it's not very good quality data. The problem is that BP actually hasn't been disclosing their credit retirements on the carbon registries. And because of this data gap, I've been sort of forced to look at projects that they claim to be using. I'll explain this in the next couple of slides. So some of the projects that have sort of been used, for example, BP has retired a huge amount of credits from this wind farm in China. This is quite a substantial amount of credits here. And please understand that a lot of these projects are avoidance, where a forest is just sitting there. It's not directly removing carbon from the atmosphere, but these are being used to justify these are being used to argue that fossil fuels are being offset across the entire life cycle. We have also some community-based projects where like making a biogas digester in a developing country village that is used also to claim that emissions are being avoided from going into the atmosphere. BP has retired a massive amount, 400,000 tons for this particular project. And then Shell is actually involved in removing carbon from the atmosphere by afforestation, including in developed countries. However, as you'll see on the next slide, the scale of this is very, very limited. So when we look at the retirement volumes, this is looking at actually confirmed credit retirements. This is much more high quality data. We see now the real behavior of the companies coming to the fore. We see that BP and Chevron have not purchased any removal credits at all. They've gone basically for avoidance credits. This was beyond the scope of my particular paper, but the reason for that is we can assume it's quite simple. Avoidance credits, because they're assumed by many stakeholders to be lower quality, to deliver fewer climate benefits, they're cheaper. They're about roughly half the price. And that's because a lot of them are coming from red projects, which there's just a huge supply of those globally. Now, these green projects, which are removal, we're looking at afforestation projects, which basically they're much smaller supply and they're much more expensive. And this sort of basically explains the situation here of very, very limited evidence of carbon removal. So let's continue. And then another sort of indicator, I think, of offset project additionality is the age of the project. And this graph here is basically showing us like the year that credits were issued for the first time from a particular project. And the United Nations CORSIA, this is an offsetting scheme for aviation, that doesn't allow a credit to be used if it's produced before 2016. So anything in red is non-eligible for UN CORSIA. Basically, the bulk of projects that are used are coming from historical projects that were set up well over a decade ago. So we could sort of start to argue that are these projects making a meaningful contribution to contemporary climate mitigation activity? Now, this again is not probably the best quality data. The sort of most carbon market experts would say we should look at the credit vintage year. This basically is the year that the farmer took the grapes from the vine and put them in the bottle and made a bottle of wine. This basically is the year that a particular action occurred that contributed to the reduction of carbon. And so this is the vintage year. And we see that Chevron actually seems to be, purchasing credits that are, relatively recent, whereas we see Shell is actually strategically purchasing very large volumes of credits that were, I guess you could almost call them zombie credits, that, produced a very, very long time ago, well over a decade ago, that sort of, don't really fit in with the description for many people of a quality offset. So let's quickly jump into the conclusions. This will just take 2 or 3 more minutes. I hope that's okay. Thank you. So just tying this up. So the question that we set out to answer was, are the majors really transitioning? We used 3 indicators, and we found that no major satisfies all the indicators. And okay, what about plans to reduce fossil fuel production? As we saw, just to revise, Shell and BP have weakened or they dropped their plans, and Chevron and ExxonMobil lack plans in the first place. So, and then no major aims to reduce their sale of fossil fuels. So therefore, no major has a plan to reduce its overall supply of fossil fuels to the market, which means that from our perspective, that no company could be considered to be pursuing a business model transformation consistent with a energy transition. And the implication of this basically is that in the absence of regulation, the oil majors are basically consistently over many years showing themselves to be incapable of downscaling their fossil fuel production, of self-cannibalization. I mean, this makes sense. And so, the current business trajectories of these companies is clearly not aligned with a 1 or 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees pathway. Many of the studies are telling us that we cannot no longer build any new oil or gas fields. This is no longer compatible with a 1.5 degrees pathway. So their business models is misaligned with this global this global objective of achieving an energy transition. Let's jump over to the offsets. We've just seen that most offset projects do not remove atmospheric carbon. On top of this, we've seen that many offset credits are aged, and therefore they're not linked to contemporary emission reduction efforts. Therefore, claims of net zero and carbon neutral are contestable. And so there's also this concern that, bundling offsets with conventional fossil fuels, that's just going to allow the continuation of business as usual activities. Now, this is the final sort of statement I'll make in the presentation. This came from Shell's website, that I think this shows you quite an interesting sort of, but maybe this concern of ours might be a little bit true. They argue that combining conventional fossil fuels with certified carbon credits, it's an interim solution. And that plays a very important part in Shell's effort to decarbonize. So I think this sort of shows you that there's a very real concern here that, this is just allowing continuation of business as usual activities. This is allowing the continuation of conventional fossil fuels. So that's the end of the presentation. And I just, sorry to throw in a bit of PR for myself here, but a PhD student that I worked with over a couple of years, our paper was published in PLOS ONE, and that's open access. And that got a bit of attention in the media, including The Guardian. They put it on the front page, and then there's ABC News in Australia. They covered that as well. So if you're interested, you could take a look at that. Otherwise, there's my email address, and I look forward to taking your questions and having a chat now. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Gregory. Can we all thank him, please? That was fascinating, detailed, deeply depressing. I might use the chair's privilege and ask an initial question, and then we'll look at online and the group. A couple of months ago now, we had Benjamin Sovacool here talking about the Genie project, where they were looking at different carbon drawdown technologies, and in a range of studies looked at assessments of the feasibility, scalability, impact, those things. And I suppose I came away from that, and others who were there, Rob, maybe correct me if I'm wrong here, but I came away from that thinking, okay, maybe nature-based solutions are a promising area here because they seem to be fast, scalable, and impactful, and that they should play a role in this space. But I guess the conclusion that we're hearing from your work is that they might be a bit doubtful and they're being overused, maybe the wrong kinds. So I guess my question to you would be, to what extent is this a fundamental problem in the nature of the credits as you understand them, or is it perhaps a regulatory design issue where too much of the wrong kinds of credits seem to be allowable under different schemes, and would that be a potential fix?
Thanks very much. That's a really important question. So I think when we look at nature-based solutions, I think we should make a very clear distinction between like an avoidance activity, which is basically just not cutting down trees that are standing today. That's like a typical RED project. And then planting new trees, afforestation or reforestation, and physically drawing down CO2 from the atmosphere. Of course, RED projects also sequester some CO2, but overall we call that like mainly a avoidance project. Now, there's obviously an important need for planting trees. I myself actually, when I, to offset some of my lifestyle, I actually plant trees as a little confession here. Now, how much hope I put on those trees of surviving and drawing down my emissions, that's another story. But we know that, restoring nature and ecosystems and using that to sequester nature, that's an extremely, I think, important task for, humanity, and corporations need to be a part of this. However, if all companies, not only the oil majors, if all companies across the world say, okay, let's try and offset our emissions through nature-based solutions, for example, through planting new trees, we need a massive amount of land for that. And there have been a few calculations. Shell have done a calculation that of the 1.5 degree consistent pathway, and they calculate that we'd need the equivalent land area of Brazil to allow humanity to offset through afforestation a significant part of its emissions. So where's that land going to come from? Right now, the global population is expanding. We have this constant competition between agricultural land and forests and conservation efforts. And so we have to probably target cheap land resources, which is in the global south usually. So this is just going to lead to the situation where, the rich carbon-intensive lifestyles and business practices of the global north are basically looking to the global south to, mop up these emissions. Now, and we also have this concern with nature-based solutions of the permanency of these projects. So if you're, using this idea of, that we need to sequester carbon on the scale of several centuries, then unfortunately forests, because they die back from disease, from fires, trees die as they grow, that doesn't really cross that bar, meet that threshold. So this brings us to the idea of, direct air capture, these technology sort of solutions. And that's a really important, I think, task for the future of being able to draw down carbon from the atmosphere and to being able to physically check that. The nice thing about direct air capture is we can physically count how much carbon was absorbed and then store that away permanently. And obviously that's theoretical, and it's only been done at a very small scale. But I think many people are hoping that the carbon offset market is moving towards technology-based permanent removal, and that nature-based solutions, even if they are removal, that's like a bridging solution, an interim solution. But I think you raised a pretty important point. And very lastly, I would say, a big feature of the carbon market is the lack of regulation. So this means that companies are basically free to choose credits based upon price. And unfortunately, what's happening right now is that some of the cheaper credits seem to be the lower quality credits, which are certainly avoidance-based credits. Thank you.
Thank you. So it sounds like increase the quality of supply and reduce the availability of the bad stuff. It would be two good things to do, wouldn't it? Yeah.
I think so. That would be an important, strategy. Yeah.
Okay. And I might just privilege people online. I don't know. I can't see them, but Mei Wei, is there questions online? Okay, great.
Yeah,
well, let's go in here.
I sort of also wanted to comment on that, because I think the other important thing is the difference between offsetting and incentivizing and paying for. So paying for avoidance and paying for nature-based solutions is a really important part of the solution, because we for both equity and climate reasons. But I think one of the reasons why these projects have run into so many problems is because they're being used to offset things that actually should be addressed in other ways by, oil majors shifting out of oil and industries reducing their emissions themselves. And because, something ClimateWorks is trying to look at is how do you have transparency around measuring kind of additionality, whether that's for kind of nature-based solutions more broadly, or for carbon credits. How do you get rigor around that so people know what they're paying for without it being this kind of zero-sum game of offsetting things that shouldn't be offset? And just, I'm interested in, have you done any work in that area at all?
Yeah, no, I think a big limitation of this project is we're looking at things from the sky. It's a very bird's eye view analysis that I'm continuing in ongoing work, and we don't look at things from the project level. So I, throughout this paper, tried to talk to people in the carbon market to get their assistance interpreting our results. And our results, I think, didn't surprise the people that are looking at the carbon market every day. However, they gave me a lot of insight into their particular perspectives. And so there is definitely, I think, a continual demand for offsets. And so this concern about additionality, this is, I think, very, very hard to sort of quantify, isn't it? And it's very hard to know, because it's sort of like almost an honesty system. We're hoping that whenever we see like especially renewable energy, would this have occurred without offsets? The answer we're expecting is no. which means that we need to give these investors an extra incentive of getting this long-term stable supply of income via carbon credits to incentivize these, to raise their appetite to take a risky investment. But that argument is increasingly no longer relevant in the world where we know that in many countries, even India included, China included, where renewable energy is now the cheapest option. So that's why we have companies such as Bloomberg, which are extremely critical about avoidance-based offsets, especially renewable energy. But I think, yeah, I mean, how do you quantify objectively additionality? This is very, very important because this is a fundamental principle that should be underpinning every offset project. So I think this is probably a challenge, I think, for market stakeholders and for academic researchers.
Thanks, Gregory. I notice Paris Online has a question.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks, Gregory, for a really important paper and really timely. I'm not sure if you've seen in the Australian context, the current government's working towards a Wall Street for nature, which has become quite controversial. They don't want to call it offsets, but everyone looking at it says, well, this looks like an offset scheme. But yeah, something to note. But my question is whether you think that net zero as a policy program will ultimately do more harm than good by essentially enabling big emitters to divert from transformative pathways like fossil fuel phase out. Is this an inherent problem of net zero as a policy objective?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think I guess if we sort of consider path dependency, net zero has really become, I think, entrenched in global mitigation actions and research, and asking the world to move away, throw away this idea of being able to sort of take actions outside that supply chain, outside the source of emissions, and then claim carbon neutrality based upon actions elsewhere. Throwing that away, I think, would be extremely difficult. If we look at all the IPCC reports, the predictions for our modeling for the future, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, we're all assuming overshoot of emissions and then making up for that with negative emissions. So, net zero, negative emissions, all these are very, very compatible concepts. And yeah, throwing that away, I think, would be very, very, I think, a difficult task. And also, if we did that, that would sort of, I think, then probably discount the importance of negative emission technologies, which we know are going to be needed. Obviously, maybe before negative emissions, we should be looking at sort of, downscaling, obviously, fossil fuels. And that's clearly the message that the United Nations now is starting to really push quite explicitly. But long term, we have to try and mop up our historical emissions. And the only way we can do that is through carbon removal. And the most promising pathway in terms of permanency would be technology-based solutions such as direct air capture. So that the expectation is that's going to be possible in the future, and that's what all the IPCC climate modelers are sort of doing as well. So if you want my opinion on whether we should throw away this idea of net zero, I probably would say no. But I think there's just many concerns I think about the reliance on offsets to meet that. That's why we have science-based targets, for example, giving guidance here, and the United Nations as well, saying if you're serious about net zero, you should not be relying on offsets. You can achieve net zero, but not through offsets. That's, I think, maybe a conversation that should become more mainstream.
Thanks, Gregory. And I believe Rob had a question too. Yeah.
Thanks, Gregory. Very fascinating presentation, and congratulations on your paper as well. Definitely, I read the abstract, but I definitely got to look more into it. I guess maybe not in defense of the companies that you are criticizing, but is this not a normal pattern in sustainability transitions, where sort of incumbents maybe move from initially ignoring the topic to sort of resisting it, to discursively engaging with it without actually changing anything, to actually starting to invest in incremental innovations? Maybe that's the phase that you now see, to actually transforming. And some of these businesses might lose out on the way, but others might actually be successful. And I mean, there's some cases where we could see that happening already in the past. There's a famous paper by Frank Hales, for instance, from sailing ships to steamships, where steam engine initially was sort of an add-on on sailing ships, but then eventually they fully replaced sailing ships. But also more recently, electric vehicles would be another one, where incumbents initially basically ignored it. Maybe then we got the hybrid plug-ins, and now you see that all the big incumbents are actually investing in electric vehicles. Or energy companies, like power companies, have done the same thing, right? to the point where some of the European companies have started to split up themselves in fossil fuel companies and renewable companies. So could you reflect sort of on that, maybe that it's a phase? And then it's not to say that you could, I think critique is really important in that process, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much. I guess like we could come back to sort of the question of why did I focus on, the oil majors and especially these 4 companies? And, maybe are there other companies that also should be looked at? I think, yes, we should be looking at other companies as well. So the idea of incumbents taking a long term the transition, yes, that's definitely, I think, historically it's been confirmed, and we know that's sort of, I guess, maybe the default behavior in the world. But I think we're concerned very much about our limited, very rapidly shrinking carbon budget. We don't really have much time. We need to see very rapid transition behavior. And we're also very concerned about, carbon lock-in. When we sort of invest in new oil and gas fields, these are multi-decade projects, and by making new investments, we're basically committing ourselves to huge amounts of emissions. That's why we have this new concept now of carbon bombs. So really, these particular players that I focused on, that are especially supplying large amounts of liquefied hydrocarbons, they have a very, very powerful position or influence on the global energy transition. And so it's very important that they're part of the energy transition. And I think the concern for a lot of people, myself included, well, there's a lot of talk coming from these companies now, and you kind of, that raises your expectations and it gets you excited, and you want to see some concrete activity. And it's kind of, frankly speaking, a little bit disappointing to see some, I guess, behavior or, in terms of net zero strategies, but also offsetting that is maybe not consistent with, I guess, our common conceptions of what a transition would look like or what a quality offset would look like. So I think they're attracting a little bit of criticism, I think, because of concerns about greenwashing. Greenwashing is increasingly becoming a very widely used word. It's no longer a taboo word. And I think the EU is starting to use that and set regulations against this. The United Nations is starting to be on, a watchdog for this. And researchers are starting to sort of pay attention to this concept. Yeah, and by the way, in our paper here, we never actually argued directly that the companies are greenwashing. That we argued that that's an implication, and the media just love this word greenwashing and just use that in their headlines. By the way, yeah.
Okay, no more questions online. All right, Ananda, did you?
No.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Here's one from Rob. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, I mean, so really like your critique on offsetting, and I think it makes sense. So let's say if we have to forget about offsetting, because it's simply the majority is not doing much, and maybe there's a way that we can make it work, but that probably requires a lot of accounting, and that comes with all sorts of trust issues and transparency issues and so on. We've seen that in other areas as well, like biofuel production. It's just really too difficult to do that in a way that it's feasible. So if you have to forget about offsetting, what is, and we also heard indeed from Benjamin sort of the large scale capturing of carbon. It's basically all of it's fundamental in all the climate scenarios, but all these technologies don't exist yet. Yeah. And they might exist in 50 years from now, which is way too late. So if you have to forget about carbon offsetting as well as these futuristic technologies, what's the effort that we need to do extra, and or that the world needs to do extra?
Yeah, so I think I think we have to be careful, I guess, to not confuse, I guess, a critique, maybe a healthy dose of criticism regarding offsets, and then like an outright rejection of offsetting. I think maybe personally speaking, I'm not outright rejecting offsetting. I think that, long term, then if this can be directed towards technology-based removal, I think this will be extremely important. And whether or not technology-based removal occurs through offsetting or not, I think is another important conversation. And I mean, it's really boils down to who's going to pay for this mopping up the atmosphere. And, us contemporary human beings, we've emitted a lot of CO2 in our lifetime. And, for our children and for future generations, we owe it to them to remove this CO2. And so that is going to cost a lot of money. And it's going to require huge industrial transformation. And who's going to take charge of that, especially economically? And that's the question we need to answer. If the public's going to pay for it, maybe we don't need offsetting. But if companies are sort of going to take the charge and use some of their funds to mop up these historical emissions, then I guess that would probably, they have to be given credit for that. So that therefore that maybe would justify the use, the need for having an offsetting mechanism market. So Yeah, I think offsettings is just unfortunately really taken off in the wrong direction. And unfortunately, that's been really strongly influenced by the United Nations CDM. So a lot of the criticisms I've made today are just well known to the people that have been studying this for quite a few years. You know, there's been a lot of criticisms against CDM for well over a decade. But the market knows that it's in hot water right now. There's every second week you see like there's an expert committee that are desperately trying to come up with new guidelines for a quality offset. The market knows that the price of avoidance especially is really plummeted in recent times. The World Bank's published an interesting thing on the state and trends of carbon pricing, which includes the voluntary carbon market. You see the price is declining. Anyway, these are the unresolved challenges. So I think everyone's concerned actually about the reputation of offsets. Not even in these are oil majors. They're very concerned too.
Maybe to end on a somewhat hopeful note, in a lot of my research with farmers about carbon schemes in Australia, I've heard from them a lot of hope, I guess, about using the resources that come in from that to transition to more sustainable agricultural models that blend carbon and biodiversity outcomes with productivity and so on too. And so I suppose maybe there's a very narrow edge to all of this where high quality, legitimate credits with the right kind of projects, you know, with good oversight, good integrity, could also be part of a valuable transition in the agricultural sector. But you know, without having a comprehensive understanding of the numbers involved, I suspect it's just a thin part of the wedge that we need to cover. But there's some hopeful possibilities, I guess, of offsetting as well that I think could be a pity to forget in the conversation. Yeah. More of a comment, I guess, than a question. Any last comments before we wrap up? I think we're at about 12. Yeah. Okay, sorry, 1. Yeah. Thanks everyone for participating today, and thank you, Gregory, again for a fascinating and interesting, thought-provoking presentation.